Hi, my name is Dr. Alessandro Corda. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. I'm also the director of the Institute for Criminology and Criminal Justice. Welcome to LawPod for this very special episode featuring Professor Katja Franko, who's our guest here in the law school for delivering the ICCJ Annual Lecture 2024. I'm also here with Dr. Teresa Dagenhart from the School of Social Science Education and Social Work at Queen's, who will be with us today to discuss Professor Franko's research and journey into the field of criminology. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Katja, I would like to start with a first general question about your biography and your academic trajectory. Can you share with us your journey into the field of criminology? What initially sparked your interest in this area, and how did your career trajectory unfolded?
Oh, that's a complicated question. I studied law in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, and then in the last year of my degree, I suddenly discovered Foucault, Discipline and Punish, and that was it, almost. I then went on to write what was then called a diploma thesis about it, and really sort of fell into the Foucault rabbit hole. And parallel with that, my personal journey was that I moved to Norway and sort of found out that I couldn't really practice my law degree there. So criminology was in a way of continuing my studies and education. So I went to PhD instead and did a PhD in criminology and in sentencing. And I saw it basically as a very sort of lucky coincidence, the fact that I don't know what would happen if I were able to practice law in Norway, if that would be a sort of a more available option. But I'm really glad that I wasn't able to in a way, and that I continued then in criminology. I had a really great supervisor, Nils Christie, who I think was one of the really central criminological thinkers, and he gave me the freedom to explore. I don't think he was particularly interested in Foucault, but he sort of enabled me to find my curiosity and to really find a pleasure in research.
How have you seen the field of criminology evolving over the past decades since you moved to Norway?
That's a good question. I moved to Norway in 1994, and in the 90s, Norway was still, actually, the department there was a very vibrant department. It was a place where sort of critical perspectives, feminist perspectives, abolitionist perspectives, Marxist perspectives were really standing quite strong. So it was, I think, probably one of the central departments within European criminology and criminology international for critical criminology. Gradually, in the 3 decades that I've sort of been there, we've had a change of generations. I think that now we have a sort of much more diverse set of topics that we are researching on. We become more international. We have more international researchers. At the time, I was actually one of the few, and a greater scope of also theoretical approaches, perspectives. But many people do study, for example, issues of Scandinavian penalty and so on. But a lot of people also do gender violence. We do global criminology, all kinds of things. So, yeah.
In your trajectory, for what I gather, you've been one of the first to illuminate the ways in which globalization touches upon the dynamics of crime and crime control. And I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about your influences in your writing, because you use a variety of theories that not always draw specifically from criminology. We know criminology is a broad field, but I find your writing really exciting, and I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit more about your theoretical influences.
Thank you, Teresa. No, you're right that at the time when I wrote Globalization and Crime in 2007, I think there weren't many books that explored that topic. So I had to sort of look for inspiration in sociology in particular. Saskia Sassen was one of the great influences, especially the work that she did in the book that she wrote in 2006, Territory, Authority and Rights, I think was really sort of seminal for my perspectives, but also anthropologists. So in a way, when I was asked by Sage, I think it was in 2005, if I would like to write a textbook, they would ask me to write about technology and crime. And I sort of wanted to write a book it's not a textbook where I know and present the work that already exists. I wanted it to be something new that also for me would be a more interesting project to embark on. So I started sort of collecting and looking at various perspectives within other disciplines. Also, the book includes also urban studies and international relations and migration studies and so on, and then sort of combine that and see how can we as criminologists use that. And I think one of the sort of strengths of criminology is that it is not a discipline that is closed. I mean, it's perhaps one of its weaknesses also that the boundaries can be sometimes quite unclear. But I think in that way, it's also open to new perspectives. And I think also that is an advantage as well, that it is Alessandra and I talked about this on our way here, as David Downs said, a rendezvous discipline in some ways, and that these rendezvous can be quite exciting in many ways.
I would like to touch on the Scandinavian criminology environment. So over the past decade, there has been so much interest worldwide for Scandinavian prisons, for the Scandinavian way to punishment. So interestingly, you told us that criminology in Norway developed in a very critical fashion. There was this huge abolitionist perspective, Niels Christie, of course. But then from the outside, the Scandinavian exceptionalism has been stressed, presenting Norway and Scandinavian jurisdictions as an example of good penality. So from someone who's not originally from Norway, but who has spent all this time in Norway, how do you grapple with this Scandinavian exceptionalism and the views from outside regarding the system that you know so well?
It is a very, very good question, actually, because I remember when John Pratt first visited Norway and I had conversations with him, he was surprised that Scandinavian criminologists were so critical, Norwegian criminologists were so critical of the Norwegian penal system. So I think the view at that time was not necessarily a very positive one, that one saw in a way the shortcomings of the system perhaps better than its strengths. And I think the conversation that John then started about the Scandinavian exceptionalism perhaps brought attention to the progressive aspects of the system. And I think many of my colleagues, especially Thomas Sugelvik and others, have since written about the Scandinavian exceptionalism, the welfare penalty, and so on, that shaped the system. So I think that there has been a greater awareness of the exceptionalist aspects, but I think also then the awareness that the system has many also dark sides. One talks about the sort of Janus face of the system, and you could say its coercive sides that perhaps are not visible immediately to people visiting Scandinavia, especially because some of the you could say the penal tourism that comes to Norway and to other countries tends to see the more idealized aspects of it. So also in my work in the past 10 years and more, I've been interested perhaps more in the dark sides, or the people who are not included in this welfare penalty, especially non-citizens, and the discourse that has developed in terms of migration. And Vanessa Barker has done similar work in Sweden, for example.
You have worked a lot on migration, and we spoke a little bit earlier about your personal trajectory as well. Can you tell us how did you start working on migration? What sparked your interest?
I think it is a question of sort of personal experiences shaping also your research interests. Definitely, 4 years ago, my book *The Crimigrant Other* came out, and when I wrote the foreword and tried to sort of figure out how did I become interested in this topic, I sort of found out that probably it was sitting in this government building, actually the police station, applying for my residence permits. And the way the building was structured was that Norwegian citizens applied for their passports in this really lovely hall with waterfalls and plants and so on. And then there was this back corridor where we were sitting applying for our residence permits. And the process was quite cumbersome, and many people also experienced it as actually quite demanding and bureaucratic. And this sort of got me interested in some of the issues of sort of the divisions between citizens and non-citizens, and how the state can be experienced quite differently by different groups. But sort of more in more scholarly terms, I think I first encountered the term crimigration law when I was at a Law and Society conference in Berlin. I think it was in 2007, perhaps. And I listened to Teresa Miller speaking about it, and then read also Juliet Stum's article on the topic, and then really sort of that got my both legal brain and criminological brain going, and applied for a research project that got funded by the European Research Council, and that's how it started.
Yeah, that was quite some time ago, and the field of crimigration has increased. There's many more people who are working on it from different disciplines, from different trajectories. And that is, to some extent, also in line with a political interest or a change political scenery in contemporary society, by which migration becomes a site of conflict. Can you tell us a little bit more about, in your work, you've explored the kind of different view on the topic? I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, certainly. I think especially the expansion of the EU in 2007 and the inclusion of Eastern European countries, and then the so-called migration crisis in 2015 and 16 were really the sort of the political watersheds in a way, in terms of how migration has been discussed, but also how it has been dealt with also within the penal system. So today, in many European countries, the proportion of foreign citizens in prisons is quite large. In Norway, for example, and most Scandinavian countries, it has been around 30% plus and minus the past 10, 15 years. But also other sort of innovations have, if you could call them that, have happened in the Scandinavian context, especially in Norway. The extensive use of deportation in addition to punishment. Sometimes we found also instead of punishment has been used. Other countries use detention extensively. My colleague Mary Bosworth has written about it, and others. So as you say, Teresa, it has become a very broad and vibrant field, sometimes called border criminologies. And so I think it is perhaps one of the sort of the strengths of criminology, again, to be able to sort of be revitalized and include these kinds of new topics. Although sometimes these sort of topics are, in a way, how much they are incorporated into the overall perspectives within criminology, or whether it is a subfield that doesn't talk to mainstream criminology, as you may call it, that's a question for debate. But I think probably, or hopefully, the way is into the mainstream rather than being a special interest.
That would have been my next question. So to what extent do you think that border criminology has been integrated in the literature, for instance, on the culture of punishment? There's a well-known article that you published with Mary Bosworth in Punishment and Society on border penality, in which you kind of call for this understanding that we need to think about punishment differently. To what extent do you think that call has been received or taken on?
Oh, it's a difficult question to answer, really. And I think it hasn't. I think there is a process going on. And certainly, I think the work that also Vanessa Barker, as editor of Punishment and Society, and Mary Bosworth as co-editor of Theoretical Criminology have done, has really contributed towards sort of integrating these kinds of perspectives into the criminological discourse. And I think it's a work in progress. Mary and I are together with Rimpel Magda and Magali now also just finished editing a handbook of border criminology. So I think it is a work in progress, but of course these things take time. At the same time, we have lots of PhDs written about it, books written about it. So it is a vibrant field, and hopefully the conversations will be more intense within the discipline. But I think in general that perhaps criminology could be better integrated, that the fact that it has grown so much has also in a way strengthened the fragmentation of the discipline. So this is one of my concerns, that when I go to the European Society of Criminology conferences or other conferences, that you tend to talk with people that you already know, that research on the topics that you are interested in, and I think we need some integrating influences and forces.
And if I can follow up on this is such a great point, because criminology should be about integration, but then at times you have like a constellation of subgroups in a way. So I think that Teresa's question was great, and my question is really kind of a follow up. So do you see like border criminologists as identifying as again border criminologists or as criminologists? So we have this field where you have human rights lawyer, sociologist, and people who would not usually identify as criminologists coming to this field, which has been kind of a blind spot for lawyers, because of course that was kind of the administrative side of things. So traditional criminal law scholar, even punishment scholars, they as you teach us, they wouldn't really recognize that as a field where they should be active and interested. But also criminologists, they kind of didn't really recognize migration for a long time as an issue. So is the project to basically reinforce and establish even more kind of this subgroup within criminology, or again integrating border criminology into kind of the mainstream and really integrating the knowledge and the people really, and having like the different groups talking to each other?
For me, it's difficult to talk about for border criminologists in general, but I think for me personally, it has been sort of an objective has been to actually include border criminology in a broader conversation. And so when I wrote the book, The Crimigrant Other, I sort of tried to draw in the criminological and sociological classics and look at what we are seeing now. How does that engage the themes that were explored by Durkheim, for example, or how does it relate to discussions that we've had about penal populism in criminology more generally? So I think this can be a very sort of fruitful way of looking at it, because we have so much knowledge accumulated over a long history of criminology about how we deal with issues of crime and deviance, that I think also border criminology is wise to include in its own perspective. So I think there is a two-way exchange here that can be very, very fruitful.
I don't know whether... So in your book, The Crimigrant Other, one of the main topic is the issue of citizenship. which is a very contentious one. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking around the uses of citizenship and in a global perspective, as you do in the book?
Yeah, you're right, Teresa. It is a very sort of difficult question, really, because I think that issues of citizenship and also the discourse of equality that has been sort of embedded in the discussions that we've had about citizenship have been really the backbone of liberal thinking about what kind of societies we would like to have in terms of social inclusion, in terms of equality of rights for various groups and so on. At the same time, that what I found and what we found in the project, and especially the work that I've also done together with my colleague Dorina Damsa, is that citizenship also has the exclusionary elements, and in that way, it's not only a social equalizer, but it's also it can be a disadvantage in terms of, especially when it comes to penalty. And so not having citizenship of the country where you live in a way puts you at a disadvantage. It puts you at a disadvantage if you, for example, do not have resident permits either and so on. But also if you are, you could call it a denizen or a sort of long-term resident, short-term resident and so on, you still can have disadvantages because you're deportable. Always your membership is in question. So for me, it has been, in a way, important to chart this territory in terms of how punishment is different for people who do not have citizenship. How does it affect them differently? And this is where the use of immigration law comes in, where in a way the combination of criminal law and immigration law has then particular effects on the groups of non-citizens. And of course, then a question also, does it have to be like this? How can we think about rights, in a way, citizenship rights for non-citizens? There's this case in Norway where the Supreme Court sort of decided that deportation was not a disproportionate measure for a citizen convicted of a serious robbery who came to Norway as a child, as an 11-year-old, and he came from I think Chechnya, and he was deported to Russia, and the Supreme Court thought this was not a disproportionate measure. And for me, it was really fascinating then to look at both the severity of the penalty, which in addition to, I think it was several years in prison, then the expulsion to a country where he had, all his family was in Norway. He didn't have any schooling in his country where he was born. Still, it is not seen as a punishment, and it's not, in a way, included into the proportionality considerations. It's, in a way, completely disjuncted from the punishment process. And I think that is perhaps the problematic part. So in that way, citizenship is, in a way, as a catalyst for creating a very different two-tier system of justice, really, where the experiences or the consequences of a criminal conviction are quite different for citizens and non-citizens. And to me, it's interesting to explore whether this is necessary or whether we could ground the use of criminal law and immigration law in a different, we can find a different normative grounding for this kind of use of penal power.
What is your impression of how the situation in Europe has evolved, I would say, over the past 20 years? Because citizenship has really become a very contentious issue from many different perspectives. Just think of the policies in Cyprus being under review now, the citizenship by investment. So you can literally buy your entry into the European Union by investing a certain amount of money in Cyprus.
In Portugal, in many places.
And this is a very contentious thing because you're basically selling citizenship. But then in many countries, and this is part of the question, do you have the impression that more constraints and more limitation, more punitive ramifications have been imposed on non-citizens? over the past, say, 20, 30 years. And then there is the external issue when it comes to the defense of the external borders of the European Union. You've written about Frontex. So what is your, again, take on how citizenship has been regulated within and outside of the European borders?
This is a very good question, an interesting one. I think we have, in a way, you could say, a very sort of bifurcated system where people who are poor and racialized, they, in a way, have really a lot of obstacles into gaining. And for them, it is especially for them that citizenship is a social disadvantage. Whereas those who are wealthy have the ability to buy into both residence rights through golden visas and even into citizenship rights, where you, as rightly point out, countries like Austria or Cyprus and so on have actually citizenship for sale. So in that way, not having citizenship is not an absolute obstacle if you are wealthy, but it is especially for those who are not wealthy. So, and I think that is a problem. And then the use of, in a way, criminal law or punishment is used to in a way create alienage, to make people lose their residence rights, especially if they are seen as unwanted. We're also seeing an increasing use of denationalization in countries like the UK, also, for example, in terms of terrorism and so on. So the question of citizenship is not stable as a category, but it's very much also should be seen in terms of other categories such as class, race, and so on. So my colleague Dorina Damsa and I, we've written an article where we sort of suggest that citizenship should be seen as one of the sort of the within the intersectionality scholarship, as one of the categories that we look at, like class, race, gender, and so on, that would give us a much more sort of nuanced perspective on both on questions of class, because I think citizenship then can offer a perspective on social advantages of citizens of countries like myself, or disadvantages. If you come from a country like Pakistan or from the global south, you are disadvantaged simply by having that citizenship, but you can then moderate that disadvantage by having wealth. So I think that there is a lot of empirical scholarship that can be done here, but I think for us as criminologists, it is interesting to see how criminal law is then also used to cancel membership rights, both in terms of terrorism as loss of citizenship, but I think also then in terms of long-term residence, you can lose these rights by committing criminal offenses or by being convicted of often quite minor offenses, really.
So you've just mentioned empirical research now, and you've done research on Frontex, the European Border Force. I wonder whether you can talk a little bit about the difficulties in accessing Frontex, if you had any. I don't know.
Yes, Frontex is not an easy organization to research on. My colleague Helene Günthersa and I, we did research on Frontex more than 10 years ago, when probably the organization was not as, in a way, controversial as it is today. And our way of gaining access to it was through Norway, in a way. So I think Frontex as a European organization perhaps is easier, more difficult to access centrally than it is perhaps by knowing sort of, because Frontex in a way consists of different national representatives, different national interests and so on. So that was just in practical terms the way in for us. But at the same time, I think there are other ways of doing research on Frontex. So I did also a few years ago a research on Frontex simply by looking at their Twitter communications, for example. And I think also quite a lot of things can be read simply by looking at that. So I think probably one has to be a little bit inventive in terms of what kind of methodological impasse you get into this field. But it's a very fascinating organization, because I think it is central in a way for Europe as Europe functions today, because it is an organization that has been growing incredibly fast. We've seen European integration on a very high level. And for me, coming from Norway, it's also interesting that Norway has been quite a part of this, even though it's not part of the European Union. We have now European border guards de facto having sort of uniforms and all that. That's I remember in the beginning in 2006 or 2004 when Frontex was being established, there were discussions about that, and it was not an issue. But after the 2016, suddenly there was this push towards sort of strengthening Frontex. And so in that way, Frontex does a very important, you could call it a dirty job for Europe, which is quite essential at the same time as Europe doesn't quite acknowledge how central Frontex is for its own existence as this bordered continent. So yeah, I think Frontex is a really interesting subject of study.
Maybe we can move on to your last book in collaboration with David Goyes, Profiting from Pablo. Can you tell us a little bit of how that topic sparked your curiosity? How did you happen to write about that?
It is a very interesting case, actually, because it was a book project that wasn't planned at all. It wasn't financed or funded either, apart from very small funding by our department. And it just came really by chance. David, who's Colombian, he invited me to give a talk there, because Colombia was also having a migration crisis on its borders with Venezuela, and we sort of did some traveling as well. And it was our meeting, or especially then meeting between Colombia that he knows so well, and me coming as a tourist and not really knowing it, but experiencing it as a tourist. And I had also, as a Western consumer, watched Narcos on television. So my knowledge of Colombia was actually very much shaped also by the media portrayals. So when we then traveled to Medellín, and me equipped with a guidebook, suddenly sort of saw the tourism that is in a way offered, the tourist experiences that are offered to foreign visitors, and based basically on or profiting from the Narcos experience, at the same time as we met then with a local journalist who had lived in and written about what was happening in the city in the 1980s and 90s. And so a completely different side of how the city experienced that period. It sort of sparked our interest, criminological interest, and we thought first that we would write just an article about it, and did then all these tourist tours and so on, and then started thinking, oh, perhaps we should interview people who have experienced this type of violence and see what they think. So David did the interviews, and also interviews with taxi drivers working in the city. So we started sort of, in a way, following these various threads that show how global consumerism, but also local consumerism, in a sense, local entrepreneurs, and especially Netflix as a really powerful media actor, in a way, has been able to shape the history of the city and the really terrible loss of lives that took place there in the 1980s and 1990s, and impose its own narrative on the city. We became then also much more aware of the strategies of resistance that also the political authorities there were trying to develop, and were ultimately unsuccessful, because this commercial power of Netflix and also other providers is so strong that the local voices basically are not heard because of that.
And this is so interesting because, again, like much of the research in Colombia has been focusing on transitional justice, on the FARC. And you really touched upon with this book on, again, yet another blind spot. So this is really a huge credit to your kind of research interest and how you, with collaborators, can really spot things that deserve to be talked about. So this is such an interesting topic because in many countries in the world, there is this issue on how to deal with victimhood, with memory. There is the case of dark tourism, for example, in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, and they also kind of make a very kind of commercial, tourist-friendly pitch. In Northern Ireland, memory is dealt with, I would say, much better in terms of how tourists are presented with the contentious past. When it comes to the Colombian case, can you give us some examples from the book in terms of how victims feel that their experience has been negatively affected or shaped by this global consumerism when it comes to the legacy of Pablo Escobar and the glamorization, if you will, of those years when they actually have to endure and go through all this suffering and losses?
I think what you point out, your question really sort of brings already on an important point, in which is the sort of the sense of anger really and injustice, that the perpetrator is the one that is now becoming a sort of a global brand, an icon that many people actually idolize, that they have tattooed on their body, that he has become really somebody who's portrayed as cool, or and also then in a way also role model for young people living in the city today. So that is one aspect that came out very much. Many also mentioned the inability to have closure because of that. They're constantly reminded when they see people wearing Escobar T-shirts on the street, or there was one who narrated about the Spanish friends who they liked quite a lot, and then suddenly they liked Narcos, and they started asking them about them. You know, it sort of creates constant reminders in their daily lives about that he is there, that somebody who really sort of was the source of a very great pain in their lives. The other one is also the inaccuracy of the narration, the historic inaccuracy of what Netflix offered, because the series became, in a way, the main narrative about what happened in the city at that time, at the same time as the producers of the series that David talked to, for example, openly said that they were not interested really in historic accuracy. They were interested in entertainment. That was the main value of the story for them. So in a way, there is a discrepancy between what are the consequences of the social effects of the series and what was the intention really. So I think the sort of it has effects on several levels, but the fact that Escobar has now become this sort of household name, somebody you can have on a T-shirt, somebody that's also looked up to, that has his own museum run by his own brother that sells coffee cups with his image on and so on, and keychains and all that, whereas victims are basically anonymous. That I think they saw as very sort of unjust.
And in terms of the different levels of commercialization, so we have kind of the global exploitation, but then, as you mentioned, you also have like local entrepreneurs profiting from Pablo. So can you tell us a little bit more about, again, the local exploitation, the local commercial exploitation?
Yes, I think one of the things that struck us when we first visited the city, and he, in a way, as a local or as a Colombian, as a guide, then sort of was the level of, if you open Lonely Planet, you can see Escobar tours. All his residences have become sites of, you could also say, almost pilgrimage. We took a tour that took us to his graveyard, and there was an Escobar impersonator, serving as our guide. somebody compared it as a resurrection, that basically he has in a way resurrected, and you can see him everywhere. And I think the fact is that there's an economy in this. People need to make money. So in a way, in some ways, if you do not have the resources, you cannot be very picky. But I think there is an industry and the interest by tourists that come to the museum run by his brother that basically then sustains this kind of economy. And what was interesting to us is that when we tried first on our first visit to find the museum about the atrocities called Casa de la Memoria, 2 or 3 taxi drivers first didn't know where it was. But everybody knew where Escobar Museum was. Also, if you look on TripAdvisor, you can very easily locate Escobar sites, whereas other sites of memory are much more hidden. So I think there was this sense that this Escobar economy is, because of the global forces, the nurturing this local offering of various kinds of services. At the same time, there are also parts of the city. There is still part of the city that is named after him. That's also so that the local memory also seems to be quite sort of divided. He has a very sort of complex legacy as well. So I think there are many levels of profiting, but at the same time, I think, and we try to point that out in the book, that profiting can be so many things, and the fact that we've written this book is a way of profiting as well. So I wouldn't want to sort of paint a black and white picture on this.
Yeah, in the book you talk about how the city has tried also to resist this global narrative, this lack of attention, say, from the producer of Narcos. Can you maybe tell a little bit more about that and what happened then when they resisted? They tried to resist, and how?
Yeah, I think especially then in the 2000s, and especially because of Narcos, especially one mayor of Medellín then tried to harness this as a political issue and use it in a way as a counter narrative, also to create a political base. And the survivors, or those who had lost the loved ones to the drug violence, were quite divided in terms of how they saw this. Some saw it then as a kind of political profiting, where it was very much about the politicians who were trying to in a way gain visibility by then speaking for the victims, and then in a way taking a voice away from them as well, whereas others were positive. I think what was good was that they've also then invested into trying to, in a way, become a part of this more international tradition of mourning mass atrocities. So if you look at the Casa de la Memoria, it's actually quite resembles quite a lot the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And there was this idea of sort of trying to travel also abroad and see how this kind of memorialization is done internationally. But at the same time, there was a sense that this was unsuccessful, that they haven't been included in these kinds of discourses. So we sort of problematize what is included into this international discourse about mass atrocities, because in terms of the loss of life, there were the numbers of victims. The loss of life was really very substantial. I think in 1987, I think that there were estimated 3,000 homicides in the city of 2 million people. So it was really an enormous loss of life. At the same time, as it's still considered just as an ordinary crime. So we sort of try to problematize this notion of an ordinary crime, and what kind of sort of avenues of recognition are then available for people who are suffering because of the consequences.
So, Katja, in your work, the notion of globalization plays a key role. globalization, of course, is the driving force behind the mass migration that we are witnessing in Europe and outside of Europe. And at the same time, globalization really shapes the identification and everyday experience of victims. In the Colombian case, when you have like these global commercial forces shaping the everyday life of survivors of the narco war. So how do you theorize, and what is the notion and the main challenge of globalization in your work? And broadly speaking, what are, in your view, the main challenges to be addressed by criminologists moving forward?
Thank you. It's a huge question, but I think perhaps what I'll try to do very briefly is sort of say that in a way globalization brings a lot of misconceptions. And I think one of the misconceptions is that it is a unifying force that sort of brings the world together. And I think it is as much is a force of division, and that the forces that sort of see globalization as a threatening process are really, really strong. So in a way, the defense of the nation state, the strength of nationalism and all that, I think is also part of the discourse about globalization. For me, what is interesting to see is how interconnected the world is, and perhaps the interconnectedness of the world, rather than this word globalization, is perhaps more productive in a sense, because this is what we are exploring. How do we affect each other across long distances? How do I, as a consumer, sitting on my sofa in the evening watching Netflix, how do I affect people on the other part of the world? But I think the other aspect that is also important, in addition to the fact that we are interconnected and that we then also have a responsibility for this world that we are creating together, is the fact, the awareness of the world being divided, that we are living in an interconnected world, but the world that is very much divided by inequality and the north-south divisions that I think now in criminology are receiving growing attention, especially with the southernization of criminology, southern criminology. I think this is really great, because this north-south relations, although the global north-south are sometimes quite crude distinctions that also need empirical nuance, but still it is, I think, a very important way of going forward and approaching, studying this. So this sort of north-south dimension has been quite important in terms of the project on Medellín that David and I did, but also in terms of migration. It is about the affluent North trying to protect its affluence, and then also identity, and the racial aspects of that are also quite important. And of course, also recently, I think there's been a sort of growing body of work and awareness of the historic aspects of globalization and the histories of imperialism and colonialism, which I think also deserve further exploration.
And if I can follow up on southernizing criminology, so what do you see as the main challenges when it comes to, again, southernizing criminology? Because some have pointed out that the risk is that we're merely imposing Western methodologies, research questions, frameworks onto the global South. So we're going to have, for example, the same paper on political economy, but focusing on, again, previously neglected jurisdictions. So what is the real challenge in your view when it comes to southernizing criminology and the north-south approach and broadening up of the field?
I think perhaps one of the main challenges is the fact that there is an imbalance in resources, and the fact that northern universities have so much more resources to do the research. And an essential aspect is that then researchers from what we would term then southern jurisdictions or southern contexts actually need to be included into the research on a much more equal basis, in order to then to have this equality of perspectives as well. I think that there's this material sort of base of how research is done, and research is predominantly done in northern universities. I think this is probably one of the greatest inequalities in that respect. So I think the inclusion, the real inclusion of southern researchers into the research project is probably essential here in order to prevent what you are talking about, the sort of the imposition of northern models on realities of other parts of the world.
And this is so interesting because until relatively recently, foreign researchers working abroad, they were welcome as long as they would start studying the local system. So they really had to make themselves acquainted with the system that they were working within, rather than studying again their own home country from the global north. So this is really something that broadens and affects the production of knowledge about southern systems.
I think the fact that the realities of doing research at a university where you do not have time to do research, where you or the research with the kinds of resources that we have, I think that the numbers of teaching that one often has to do, or all these different kinds of things, are really quite essential for how ability to actually download papers that are being written, all these sort of paywalls that exist, all these kinds of things really have a lot to say for the ability of research to become properly international. So I think the material infrastructure that of research processes is actually something that really needs to the imbalance needs to be repaired.
If I then can close with a question, as a leading figure in the field, what advice would you offer to aspiring researchers and students interested in pursuing careers in criminology or related disciplines? And are there any lessons that, from your own experience, that you would like to share with the audience?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to give advice, but from my own experience, I think pursuing what interests you and what you feel passionate about is actually what is the most important thing to do. That criminologists or researchers, as others, we are in a way often following trends, and I think in order to be creative, you probably have to go a bit outside of what is fashionable and dare to look at other topics that are not exactly on the top of the agenda at the moment, but there are openings there then to actually be creative on your own terms. And the other thing that I think is quite important is to sort of look a little bit away from this sort of pressure to produce that I think that we see now more and more, that research has become in a way a cycle of, you could almost call it a sort of capitalist production. I think that we cannot produce really good quality research in large quantities. So I would say go for the quality, not for the quantity, if that is possible, because obviously there are institutional pressures to do otherwise. But I think both to sustain one's own sort of motivation to be in this business, so to call it, and also to be able to be creative and actually contribute with something new, you sort of need to take time. And I think that the time is perhaps the luxury that established researchers have more than young researchers. At the same time, as I think perhaps the pressure to publish a lot is sometimes also self-imposed. So to look at how much of it is actually, how much do I need to do really? And in a way, just slow down. I think we are living in a very, very fast times, and I'm not sure if that is the best sort of ground for growing good research, really.
Great. So passion and time.
Yeah.
We have sadly reached the end of this episode of Law Pod. I would like to thank my co-host Teresa Dagenhardt, and above all, We would love to thank our amazing guest today, Professor Katja Franko. Katja, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The pleasure has been all mine.